Have you ever left work and felt your whole personality like just return on the journey home? Your shoulders drop, your face relaxes, your real voice comes back, your humor comes back. You start replaying the day, and suddenly you know exactly what you should have said in that meeting. And you realize that for like the last 8 hours, you weren't necessarily being fake, but you were being this carefully edited, work appropriate version of yourself. You were managing your tone, you were monitoring your face, you were thinking about how confident was too confident, how direct was too direct, how frustrated you were allowed to look throughout the day, how much of your real personality the room could comfortably receive. And after doing all that for long enough, it can start to feel like you've lost your confidence, or maybe even lost a part of yourself. But what if you haven't lost it? What if you were simply exhausted from performing all day? Okay, so welcome back to Blaque Noire, or if you're new here, welcome to Blaque Noire. I'm Tanya, and this is a space where we talk about healing, growth, and rebuilding your life in a real, honest, and more importantly, an unfiltered way. And every week we have the conversations that so many of us have been carrying quietly. And today we're talking about career confidence, code switching, and what happens when the workplace only ever gets to meet the edited version of you. I personally think that a lot of us have spent years believing that maybe we had a confidence problem, when actually, all we may have had was actually an environment problem or a belonging problem, a safety problem, or simply the exhaustion that comes from constantly thinking about how other people are experiencing you. So today, I really want to talk honestly about that. Not in a way that pretends every workplace is safe, not in a way that tells black women to just walk into every room and say whatever they want without considering any consequences, okay? Of course not, right? Because we're not naive. We understand power. We understand hierarchy. We understand that how we're perceived can affect a number of things, right? From job opportunities to progression, relationships, and sometimes whether we even get to remain in the room at all. But there is a difference. Choosing how you communicate and feeling that your real self is professionally unacceptable. And that's what I'm going to explore with you today. So I think the majority of black women will agree with me that in workspaces where we are the minority, we have a particular version of ourselves that walks into that workplace every day. Okay. She's polished, she's capable, she's prepared, she knows what she's doing. But she's also calculating, okay? She knows when to smile. She knows when not to react. She knows when to soften a sentence. She knows when to turn a clear statement into more of a suggestion. She knows when to say, maybe we could possibly consider, instead of simply saying, this is what I think we should do. She knows when something has offended her, but she also knows that showing any sign of being offended may actually create more problems than the original comment itself. For many of us, this version of ourselves has become so familiar that we don't even recognize it as code switching anymore. It just feels like professionalism. It feels like maturity. It feels like knowing how to behave. And sometimes, it is all of those things, okay? But sometimes what we actually call professionalism is actually a set of behaviors that we've learned to make ourselves come across as less threatening, less visible, or easier for other people to understand. And that doesn't mean every adjustment is wrong, as to be fair, we all communicate differently, right? Depending on the setting. We don't speak to our boss in the same way that we speak to our best friend. We don't speak in a formal presentation exactly as we speak when we're sitting at home, okay? And that's normal. That is emotional intelligence. But there is a distinct difference between adjusting your communication style and editing your whole identity. And I think that many black women, we know exactly, where that line is, even if you've never had the words to describe it. It's the moment when you're no longer choosing how to communicate. You're choosing which parts of yourself are safe enough to be seen and made visible. So for me, code switching didn't begin in adulthood. As I've told you all before, I grew up in a predominantly white, area, predominantly white environments. And when you grow up in spaces where you're often one of, if not the only black person, or one of very few, you become very observant. You notice what gets accepted. You notice what gets questioned. You notice which parts of you make other people curious. You also notice which parts of you make people uncomfortable. And you just learn to adapt. And sometimes that adaptation is conscious, but often it isn't, okay? It becomes instinctive. You learn how to speak in a way that gets you understood. You learn what version of yourself gets called articulate. You learn what version of yourself gets described as polite, impressive, or even well spoken, even though I hate when people say that. And you also learn often very early on that you're being interpreted by others by assumptions that other people don't ever have to think about. Now, if I'm honest, I don't think I would have called it code switching at the time. I would have just said I knew how to fit in. I knew how to behave in different environments. I knew how to make people comfortable. And that ability helped me. And if I'm being honest, I'm not going to pretend, that being able to do that hasn't helped me. It's definitely allowed me to build relationships. It's allowed me to, move through spaces. It's allowed me to work in predominantly white workplaces and communicate with people from completely different backgrounds. It's definitely helped me professionally. But the uncomfortable truth is that something that helps you can also end up costing you. Something can be seen as a skill and still become exhausting. Something can protect you and still disconnect you from parts of yourself. And that's why I think this conversation becomes more complicated. Because when we talk about code switching, people sometimes act as though there are only two choices. One, either you completely adapt and survive, or you walk into every room as your full, unfiltered self and accept whatever it is that happens. But real life is a lot more complex than that. Most of us are truly just navigating somewhere, in the middle. We're making constant calculations about how much of ourselves the room can handle. Now, understand that there's nothing inherently wrong with adaptation. Adaptability is one of the many reasons Black women have succeeded in environments that, quite frankly, were not designed with this in mind. We know how to read a room. We know how to adjust. We know how to build relationships when there are differences. We know how to survive. But survival skills can become so automatic that we stop asking whether we still need them in every moment. And that's when adaptation can slowly become self-erasure. Self-erasure doesn't always look dramatic. It might look like having a good idea in a meeting, but waiting for someone else to say something similar before you support it. It might look like starting every contribution with, I might be wrong, but it might look like apologizing before you've even spoken. It might look like laughing when something quite frankly wasn't funny. It might look like remaining calm to the point where your real feelings become invisible. It might look like letting somebody interrupt you because correcting them just feels too risky. It might look like changing your hair and mentally preparing yourself for the comments before you walk through the door. It might look like removing the emotion from your voice because you don't want your passion to be seen as aggression. It might look like doing extra work so nobody can question whether you deserve to be there. It might look like making yourself useful, endlessly agreeable, endlessly dependable, because you've learned that being needed can feel safer than simply being valued. And over time, you can become so good at performing, the acceptable version of yourself that you start forgetting who you are when you're not performing. You start confusing acceptance with success. You start believing that being liked is the same thing as being respected. You start thinking that the version of you who makes everyone comfortable is the professional version of you. And everything else is too much. It's too loud. It's too emotional. Too ambitious, too direct, quite frankly, too black, right? Too female, too complicated, too difficult. And that message can really begin to shape your own relationship with yourself. Now, one of the things that I've had to understand is that confidence is contextual. Okay, we're often told that confidence is something you either have or you don't. You're either a confident person or you're not. But I don't actually think that that's true, because you can be very confident with your friends, very decisive when it comes to your family, very capable in your everyday life. You can know exactly what you think. You can be, articulate. You can be funny. You can have a strong presence, and then you walk into a particular workplace or a particular meeting and suddenly you hesitate. You second guess yourself. You rehearse simple sentences before actually even speaking. You soften every opinion, you over explain, and then you leave the room thinking, why didn't I just say what I wanted to say? Now, that doesn't automatically mean that you're an insecure person. It might mean that your nervous system understands something about that room. It might mean that you've learned through experience that your confidence is received differently, because confidence doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's affected by whether you feel respected, whether you feel safe, whether you're heard, whether people assume competence when you speak, whether mistakes are treated as normal or used as confirmation of your lack of ability, whether your directness is welcomed or described as intimidating. whether you're allowed complexity, whether you're seen as an individual, sorry, or as a representative of like an entire group. So sometimes the question isn't why am I not confident? Sometimes the question is what happens in this environment that makes my confidence feel unsafe? And that is a very different question because the first question makes the problem entirely personal. The second question really gives context, and context doesn't remove, responsibility, but it does remove unnecessary shame. Now, I know I'm not the only person who becomes incredibly articulate after the meeting has ended. When you're not in the room and you say something like, when you are in the room, sorry, and you say something like, oh, maybe we could possibly think about exploring another option. Then 5 minutes later, after you've left, when you're on your own, you've got the full speech in your head that you should have given. You've got the evidence, the examples, the perfectly timed closing statement, the imaginary standing ovation. And suddenly you've become the most articulate woman in the UK, right? And it's funny, but it also tells us something because sometimes you weren't struggling to think in the meeting, but there was a part of your brain that was doing the work, and then there was another part of your brain that was managing the room. You were thinking about the hierarchy in the room. You were thinking about who had already spoken. You were thinking about your tone. You were thinking about whether the point might be seen as challenging. You were thinking about whether you needed more evidence than somebody else would need. You were thinking about whether confidence would be received as competence or as aggression. You were thinking about whether it's worth the emotional energy. So it isn't always that you have nothing to say. Sometimes you are just carrying too many calculations at once. And once you leave the room, all of those calculations disappear. And that's when the full sentence arrives. That's when your real response returns. And I think many of us interpret that as proof that we're not quick enough, not confident enough, or senior enough. But sometimes it's actually just proof that the room required too much management for you to be able to show up as your full self. Now, another thing that black women in the workplace know they have to come is what I like to call the stereotype tax. So, as black women, we don't enter professional spaces as minorities without there being some sort of history, right? Even if nobody says anything directly, we know the stereotypes. We know that anger can be interpreted differently when it comes from us. We know that confidence can be interpreted differently. We know that expression of our emotions can be interpreted differently. We know that assertiveness can be seen as aggression. We know that boundaries can be seen as attitude. We know that being quiet can be seen as, disengagement. We know whilst speaking up can be seen as, dominating. And that creates what I think of as this stereotype tax. It's the additional mental and emotional labor of trying, I guess, not to confirm someone else's assumption about you. Okay, you're not only thinking about what you want to say, you're also thinking about how your words will interact with a stereotype that's existed in this room before you even entered. And that in itself is exhausting. And it can create this level of self monitoring that other people don't ever see. They only ever see your final response. They don't see the internal editing process that you're going through. They don't see the 5 versions of the sentence that you rejected before choosing the safest one to say out loud. They don't see the reaction that you've, swallowed and held in. They don't see the emotional regulation. They don't see the extra preparation. They don't see the mental replay afterwards. They don't see the moment you got home and realize, you've been holding tension in your body all day. Now that labor is invisible, but it is real. And when black women are told to simply just be more confident without acknowledging that labor, the advice can almost feel, I guess, insulting, right? Because many of us, we're not lacking confidence, okay? But what we're doing is we're carrying consequences. So, super quick story time for you, okay? Now, I remember this was very early on in my career, and I'd just been to a client meeting with my line manager, and we were driving back to the office in the car. He turned to me and said, you know what, Tanya, you say you're confident, but you're actually not. You can tell by how you were in the meeting. You didn't say much. And I'm sat in this man's car and I couldn't believe what he was saying to me, okay? And I remember pausing before responding because I was thinking to myself, my guy, like, I'm a young woman. I was like 21 at the time. And, I've been doing this job only for a few months. It was my first time ever meeting the client. Everyone in that room was like a 40 plus year old white man who'd been doing the job for like 10 to 15 years. I'm quiet because not only am I learning, but I'm also scanning the room to try and read everyone and understand what's acceptable for me to say and do. And more importantly, what version of myself I need to portray so as I can be seen and received correctly. I was thinking to myself, you have literally no idea what I go through, okay? Unlike you, in these situations, I can't just turn up and be there, right? I have to make sure that I come across in the right way so that people receive me in the way that I want them to. Now, this isn't only about emotion, okay? This type of thing can genuinely affect careers because when you're constantly monitoring self, you may take fewer risks. You might share fewer ideas. You might make yourself less visible. You might hesitate before putting yourself forward. You might downplay your achievements because you don't want to appear arrogant. You might accept extra work because saying no feels dangerous to you. You might become known as reliable but not necessarily recognized as strategic. You might support other people's leadership while doubting whether your own style looks like leadership. You might imitate the people already in senior positions because you've never been given permission to lead in a way that feels natural to you. And that can create this strange gap between how capable you are and how much of that capability the workplace actually gets to see. Now, as a black woman, right, you could be doing incredibly well on paper. You can be experienced, you can be intelligent, you can be constantly delivering, you can be respected, and still feel disconnected from your authority because achievement doesn't automatically create belonging, right? A promotion doesn't automatically remove this self monitoring. A senior title doesn't automatically mean you feel free to take up space because sometimes you become more successful while also becoming a more edited version of yourself because the stakes at that point they become higher. The rooms that you're in become more senior, the scrutiny becomes greater, and you may feel even stronger responsibility to get everything right. And this is one reason why professional burnout can be so complicated for Black women. Sometimes it's not that we're only tired from the workload. We're tired from the performance around the workload. We're tired from being, excellent and palatable, strong but non-threatening, ambitious and grateful, visible but don't forget not too visible, honest but never emotional, and confident but never intimidating. And that is an impossible standard to uphold for a prolonged period of time, right? One of the deepest costs of constant self-editing is that it can eventually make you distrust your own instincts. You stop knowing whether your reaction is reasonable. You stop knowing whether your idea is good enough. You stop knowing whether your boundary is fair. You stop knowing whether your tone is actually the problem or whether somebody simply just didn't like what you had to say. You start asking people to confirm things you already know. Did I sound rude? Was I too direct? Do you think I should apologize? Did I overreact? Was that a stupid idea? You become dependent on external reassurance because you've spent so long being told directly or indirectly that your natural responses need editing. And that's where confidence becomes connected to self-trust. Because confidence isn't only about speaking loudly, it's about believing in your own perception. It's about trusting that you know what you experience. It's about knowing that discomfort doesn't automatically mean that you did something wrong. It's about allowing yourself to have an opinion before checking whether anyone else agrees. And for many Black women, rebuilding confidence means rebuilding that relationship with your own judgment. Now, I don't want to give simplistic advice. I'm not going to say, just be your fullest authentic self everywhere, because we all know authenticity without safety can have some serious consequences. And it's unfair, I think, to ask Black women to carry all the risk of transforming environments that they quite frankly didn't create. You don't have to become a workplace activist every day, right? You don't have to challenge every comment. You don't have to explain every issue. You don't have to sacrifice your income to prove that you're authentic. Discernment isn't cowardice. Choosing your battles isn't weakness. Protecting yourself isn't failure. But protection should still feel like a choice. And the real question is, are you deciding how to respond on your own? or whether fear is actually deciding for you before you've even had the chance to think. So rebuilding that confidence can begin very quietly. It doesn't need to be this dramatic personality transformation. It might just begin with noticing when you're softening a strong idea unnecessarily, noticing when you apologize before you speak, noticing when you laugh just to reduce the tension in the room, noticing when you over explain a boundary of yours, noticing when you assume a disagreement means that you communicated badly, noticing when you leave a room and immediately blame yourself. Awareness gives you space, and inside that space you can begin to choose, you can begin to really reclaim your voice, right? Now when I say reclaim your voice, I don't only mean your accent, right? I mean the way you express yourself, the way you express clarity, the way you contribute, the way you allow an idea to stand without you having to soften it. Try removing one unnecessary apology, right? Instead of saying, I don't know, sorry, I just want to add, you can simply say, I'd like to add something. Instead of, you know, saying this might be a silly idea, you can simply say, one option we could consider is, instead of making a point and then following up with, I don't know if this makes sense. You can simply just start it by saying, my perspective is. Now, these sound like really small changes, okay? But the truth is, language shapes how we express ourselves. Every time you remove an unnecessary apology, you send yourself a message that your contribution doesn't require permission. And again, this isn't about being rude. It's not about speaking without care or concern. It's about separating that kindness from self minimization. You can be warm without making yourself smaller. You can be collaborative without pretending you have no opinion. You can be respectful without sounding uncertain. Okay. And quite frankly, another part of confidence is boundaries. Many Black women have been taught that being indispensable creates this level of security. We become that woman who can handle absolutely anything, the person who always helps, the person who stays late, the person who fixes the problem, the person who carries the emotional weight of the team. And being needed can truly feel like protection. But being needed is not the same as being valued. Sometimes the more capable you appear, the more work you are given without the recognition, progression, or support that should actually come with it. Reclaiming confidence may actually mean allowing a boundary to remain a boundary. You don't always need a long explanation. You don't always need to prove, that you're overwhelmed enough that you actually deserve support. Okay. You can simply just say, I don't have the capacity to take that on today. I can complete this by Friday, but not by Wednesday. If this is now the priority, I'll need clarity on what should move. Or I'd like to finish my points. I'm not comfortable with that comment. These sentences may feel simple when we hear them, but using them can actually feel deeply uncomfortable, especially if you've learned, like so many of us, that being agreeable keeps you safe. That discomfort doesn't mean the boundary is wrong. It simply means that the boundary is just new to you. Another thing, actually, I'd like to talk about is, I guess, appearance, right? For Black women, appearance at work is never just appearance, okay? Your hair becomes a conversation. Your clothing can become judgment. Something that feels so ordinary to us can suddenly become something that other people believe they're entitled to discuss. And sometimes we prepare ourselves mentally before making a change. You can change your hair and you already know the comments are coming. Is that all yours? How did you do that? Can I touch it? It looks so different. Oh, I wish I could just change my hair like that whenever I felt like it. And sometimes, quite frankly, it's easier to just avoid the attention. But constantly managing your appearance around other people's comfort can create this additional layer of distance from yourself. Reclaiming your appearance doesn't mean you've got to dress or wear your hair in any particular way. It means, you get to notice whether your choices are coming from preference or fear. Do you genuinely like the way that you present yourself at work? Or are you actually making every decision based on what feels least likely to attract judgment? Again, there's no shame in choosing safely, but there is power in recognizing that difference. Uh, so, also, many of us, we've spent years observing what leadership looks like, especially in less diverse workplaces. And often the people in the senior positions, they don't look like us, okay? Their communication style could be very different. Their confidence may be expressed differently. Their relationships with authority may be different. So we can begin to believe that leadership has, I guess, one particular shape, one particular voice, one particular personality, or one particular look. And, if we don't fit that model, we may doubt whether we're actually leadership material. But your type of leadership doesn't need to be this carbon copy of someone else's. You can lead through warmth, you can lead through clarity, emotional intelligence, creativity, through strong relationship building, through calm decision making, through honesty, through vision, the through consistency, through cultural awareness. You can build it through the ability to understand people who've been overlooked. These are not soft extras. These are genuine leadership strengths. And part of reclaiming confidence is learning to recognize what your own style is, rather than constantly measuring yourself against the people who were allowed to define professionalism before you even arrived. I understand that confidence is not only built internally, it's also built relationally. We need spaces where we don't have to explain everything, where we don't have to translate our experiences, where our reactions make sense, where someone understands the meaning behind the comment, where we can just say, this happened, and the first response isn't, are you sure that's what they meant? Understand that community matters, mentorship matters, Black professional networks matter, friendships with people who understand us matter. The Blaque Noire sisterhood, it matters, okay? Because when you've got spaces where your full self is recognized, it becomes easier to remember who you are in spaces that typically only tend to receive part of you. Sometimes confidence isn't about changing the workplace version of yourself overnight. Sometimes it is just about staying connected to the version of yourself that exists outside of work. The woman who's funny, the woman who's certain, the woman who's expressive, the woman who's ambitious, the woman who knows what she thinks, the woman who doesn't need to rehearse being herself. You need places where that woman remains and is quite frankly allowed to be visible. Now, I always like to give you guys a bit of a task, right? So I want you to think about your own working life and ask yourself, what changes first when I when I enter work? Is it my voice, my face, my language, my hair, clothing, humor, my emotional expression, my ambition, my willingness to disagree, my willingness, I guess, to ask for more? And then once you've identified that, ask yourself, what am I protecting myself from? Am I protecting myself from being misunderstood, from being seen as difficult, from losing an opportunity, from conforming to some stereotype, from conflict, from rejection, from being too visible? And then I ask, is this adaptation still serving me? Because some adaptations may still be necessary. Some may still and will protect you. Some may still be, wise or safe for you. But others may simply just be old habits that you've carried into rooms where you now have more authority, more experience, more choice than you did previously. It might be that you're actually shrinking according to a version of yourself that no longer reflects where you actually are. And then finally ask, what's one part of myself I can reclaim without placing myself at unnecessary risk? Is that one idea spoken more clearly, one apology removed, one boundary stated, one meeting where you don't have to feel like you need to rush to fill the silence? One day where you just wear your hair how you want it without having to prepare some kind of defense. One moment where you trust your own interpretation. Confidence is built through evidence, and every small act of reclamation becomes evidence that you can remain connected to yourself while still navigating the room. And I want to say this very clearly. You have not failed because you've adapted. I've adapted, and I'll be honest, I still do in certain areas, okay? You've not betrayed yourself because you've learned how to survive. You've not been fake because different environments received different parts of you. You did what you needed to do. You used the intelligence available to you. You read the room, you protected your career, you protected your income and your peace. And there is absolutely no shame in that whatsoever. But you are allowed to reassess. You are allowed to decide that some versions of protection have become, quite frankly, just too expensive for you now. You're allowed to want more ease. You're allowed to want workplaces where your competence doesn't require constant translation. You're allowed to want success, right, without self-erasure. You're allowed to become more visible to yourself. So, I guess to sum up, maybe your confidence isn't broken. Maybe it's just been buried beneath years of self monitoring. Maybe the woman who speaks freely with her friends, she hasn't disappeared. Maybe the woman who knows exactly what she thinks is still there. Maybe the woman who, I don't know, laughs loudly, expresses emotion, has strong opinions, and carries ambition without apology is still there. She may simply be waiting for spaces where she doesn't have to calculate the cost of being seen. The goal isn't to become fearless in every room. The goal is to stop using your adaptation as evidence that you're inadequate. You're not less confident because you've noticed the room. You're not weak because you've understood the consequences. You're not inauthentic because you've protected yourself. But you do deserve more rooms where disappearing or hiding yourself just isn't required anymore. And until those rooms truthfully become more common, I want you to stay connected with the version of yourself that the workplace doesn't always get to meet, because she's still you and she's always been you, and she really deserves to have a say in the life and career that she's building. So, one more question for you to think about this week, and I've given you a couple already, right? What part of yourself have you learned to mute at work? And what would it look like to reclaim just a little bit of it now? As always, please leave your thoughts in the comments, because I know this is a conversation that so many of us will recognise. And if you're part of the Blaque Noire Sisterhood over on Facebook, come over and let's continue the conversation in there. And if you're not, join, okay? So, also, just to remind you guys, get this week's issue of the Blaque Noire edit straight to your inbox. I'll pop the link to the link to it in the description below. And if this is a conversation that resonated with you, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, as it really helps it to get seen by other Black women just like you. And share this with another woman who may have spent years believing that she's had a confidence problem, when actually she was just carrying the weight of how she's constantly being perceived. As always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of Blaque Noire. Come and join the Blaque Noire Sisterhood group over on Facebook. Again, I'll pop the link in the description. If you're not already, follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and I will see you in the next conversation.